It's no secret that the formidable Soviet tech tree prominently features a significant number of American and British vehicles that were generously supplied to the Soviet Union through the crucial Lend-Lease program and under the relevant agreement between the USSR and Great Britain, specifically from 1941 to 1945. These include the M4A2 76W, the T-48 GMC, also known as the Su-57, the M3 Lee, also called the M3 Medium, the Mark II Matilda, the Mark IX Valentine, and many others you can see on your screens. It might seem like a very impressive list, but nevertheless, there are still a number of vehicles that Gaijin might one day decide to add as event or premium vehicles, and these machines are quite interesting. These include the T-70 GMC, the M10 Wolverine, the T-26 E5, the Churchill, the M4A2 with a 75mm gun, the Comet, and others. In this video, we'll be talking about these vehicles. In October 2023, two proposals appeared on the New War Thunder forum to add the Pershing to the Soviet tech tree, accompanied by an acceptance certificate from April 1945. It listed the cargo that arrived from the USA in Murmansk as part of convoy JW-66 on the SS August Belmont transport ship, along with Shermans and other cargo. The list also includes one heavy tank T-26E3. In the 20s of May 1945, it arrived at the Kubinka Research Armored Vehicle Proving Ground, where it underwent testing. As a result of the tests, Soviet specialists pointed out that the tank did not meet modern requirements. After the tests, it was sent to Leningrad, from where it never returned. Many might note that the basis for introducing it into the branch is insufficient. But, for example, the Swedish branch commonly received the T-80U and the T-28A. And that's despite the fact that two T-80Us were only leased by the Swedes in 1993 for testing, after which the tanks were returned. The Mi-28A was added to the Swedish branch because it participated in Sweden's competition for a new attack helicopter, which took place in 1995. In the end, the competition led nowhere, and the helicopter was sent back to Russia. So, under these circumstances, the Pershing could very well be added too. Of course, it would be disingenuous to say that these cases are exactly equivalent. After all, the aforementioned vehicles were added to the Swedish branch because there was a need to fill out the top tiers. But still, it's a precedent. If the Soviet Pershing is added, it could be a marathon reward, a premium vehicle, or a battle pass prize. In short, we keep watching the situation. Initially, the Soviet leadership decided to purchase two M10S for testing, and if the trials were successful, to order a batch of 50 vehicles. On August 3, 1943, a convoy arrived in the Persian Gulf, delivering two M10S. Soon the vehicles arrived in Baku, where their paths diverged. One vehicle was sent to the Kubinka Proving Ground of the Research Institute of Armored Vehicles for mobility tests, while the other was sent to the Gorokhovets Artillery Scientific Test Range for artillery trials. The tests dragged on, but nevertheless, they were successful. In February 1944, another 48 M10S arrived in the USSR. 44 M10S were assigned to the 1,239th and 1,223rd Self-Propelled Artillery Regiments. It is known that as part of these units, the M10S took part in Operation Bagration in the summer of 1944. There is a thread on the English-language War Thunder forum suggesting the introduction of the M10 into the Soviet tech tree. 59% of users on the English-language forum voted in favor of adding this vehicle to the game. The T-70 GMC, which were essentially pre-production prototypes of the M18 GMC, were also delivered to the USSR in a trial batch of 5 units. However, the main armored directorate of the Red Army was not satisfied with the results of the vehicle's trials. Among the drawbacks, they noted weak protection, insufficient mobility, high fuel consumption, and the fact that it had a gasoline engine. Despite the unsatisfactory test results, the American self-propelled gun still found a use at the Kubinka Proving Ground. It took part in tests involving the shelling of the hull and turret sides of the second Tiger. It turned out that the 76mm M62 shell could penetrate the side armor of the German heavy tank at a distance of 2 kilometers. One of the delivered vehicles has survived to this day and is on display at the Tank Museum in Kubinka. On the forum, there's a suggestion from user LWX219 to add the Hellcat to the Soviet tech tree. He argues that the Hellcat should be added because the Soviets lack a proper light tank at mid-tiers. According to him, unlike the PT-76B, this one has gun handling speed, gun depression, mobility, and a chambered gun with decent penetration. And there simply aren't any better options, so adding it seems like the obvious choice. If the vehicle is added to the game, it could become a reward for another battle pass, a marathon, or it might just be sold as a bundle, or for gold. By the way, 68% of players voted in favor of adding this vehicle to the game, and the proposal itself has been marked as forwarded to the developers. The diesel M4A2 with a 75mm gun was also exported by the United States to the USSR and became the most widely supplied foreign tank sent to the Soviet Union under the Lend-Lease program. It saw active combat and is even featured in the German tech tree as a trophy tank. captured either from Soviet forces, the British, or, in some cases, from the US Marine Corps, who also used diesel M4A2s. The first 26 Shermans arrived in the USSR in November 1942. Until 1944, the pace of deliveries was rather modest. But then that changed, and the number of vehicles supplied started to be counted in the thousands. According to American records, 1,990 tanks of this type were delivered to the USSR. And starting from October 1944, M4A2s with the 76mm gun, which are already featured in the game, also began to arrive. On the forum, 64% of users supported adding the Sherman M4A2 with the 75mm gun to the Soviet tech tree. The first light tanks, M3 Stewart, arrived in the USSR with the PQ-6 convoy on December 20th, 1941, in a batch of 31 units. Subsequent deliveries of these tanks were modest, but this changed in May 1942, when 201 tanks of this type arrived in Murmansk with the PQ-15 convoy. In total, during 1942, the Soviet Union received 977 Stewarts, including the M3A1 modification. In 1943, another 255 of these vehicles arrived in the Soviet Union, as well as 5 M5A1s for testing purposes. The Stewarts reached the front in May 1942 and took part in the Kharkov operation. By June 1944, there would be fewer than 300 of this type of vehicle in the tank units of the Red Army. They would be used by the Red Army until the end of the war. On the official forum, the idea of introducing this particular tank into the Soviet tech tree was met rather coldly. Only 55% of the total users voted in favor. The Stewarts were not the only light tanks from the US supplied to the USSR. At the beginning of 1945, the Soviet Purchasing Commission ordered 2 samples of the M24 Chaffee for testing. On March 21, 1945, the tanks arrived in Murmansk with convoy JW-65, and by April 10th they were at the night proving ground in Kubinka. As a result of the tests, the tank did not satisfy the Soviet specialists. They pointed out that its armor and armament did not meet contemporary standards. As I mentioned earlier, not only American tanks were supplied to the Soviet Union under the Lend-Lease program, but also British ones. This was done within the framework of the aforementioned agreement between the USSR and the United Kingdom on mutual supplies, credit, and payment procedures. More than 900 Matildas and over 3,300 Valentines of various modifications were sent by Great Britain to the USSR. The game features a Matilda modified by Soviet specialists with an F-96 gun, also known as the ZIS-5. This vehicle was built as a single prototype and tested in December 1941. And although it was planned to produce 120 of these vehicles, the idea of rearming was abandoned for various reasons, one of which was the reluctance to further burden Plant No. 112, which was mastering the production of the T-34, with the rearmament of the Matildas. There were also plans to rearm the Valentines. In that same December of 1941, a Valentine II equipped with a Soviet 45mm gun underwent testing, which may possibly be introduced in the game in the future. For now, we only have the 9th Valentine with the 57mm gun. And in fact, this is the best modification of this tank that the British supplied. By the way, there were 7 of these modifications. As for the Matilda, it's unlikely that any other modifications besides the ones already available will be added to the Soviet line, since the second Matilda with the 40mm gun is boring, and the Soviet line probably doesn't need it. Although there is a suggestion to add this vehicle to the game on the English language forum, and 62% of users voted in favor. There was also a version of the Matilda called the 4CS, meaning close support, but it's not represented in the game at all, since its 76mm gun only fired high explosive and smoke shells. On July 11, 1942, the infamous PQ-17 convoy arrived at the port of Arkhangelsk. On one of the ships that survived the attack by German submarines, the Ocean Freedom, 5 Churchill II and 5 Churchill III tanks were delivered to the USSR. The remaining 15 vehicles did not make it to their destination. The next batch of 74 vehicles arrived with the PQ-18 convoy. In January 1943, the first Churchill 4 tanks arrived in Murmansk together with the JW-52 convoy. 2 more shipments of Churchills took place in February and August of 1943. In total, the Soviet Union received 253 of these tanks, of which 150 were the Churchill 4 modification. Many of them arrived with defects. For example, the Mark III tanks had issues with the recoil mechanism of their guns, which had to be fixed. Deployment to the front was delayed. Nevertheless, on December 31, 1942, the Churchills began to arrive directly at the front, where they were actively used until 1944, after which they were gradually replaced in tank units by heavy tanks of Soviet production. So, in summary, one of the 3 machines mentioned above could end up in the Soviet tech tree. Moreover, the delivery documents mention 3 Churchill Crocodile flamethrower tanks and 1 Comet medium tank. Both of them are on display in Kubinka. The UK also supplied the USSR with 20 Tetrarchs, as well as a small number of Cromwell IDs for testing, which ultimately proved unsuccessful. On that same English language forum, there was a suggestion to introduce the Churchill for the Soviets. 70% of users voted in favor,